G'day everyone, welcome to Safe As Q&A, a sprint through targeted questions with really interesting people. Let's see my high budget intro. Really appreciate the time today, Sid. It's been a while since we've actually properly spoken, so really keen to get your views on some of these questions. So what I'm going to do is I'll throw out the question, start the timer, and we're just going to see if it actually works. I don't know if 30 seconds is enough time,
Fine.
but let's do it. The first one I think is pretty ambitious. Sorry, let me just say, do you want to give the viewers a little bit of a background? So your elevator picture of who you are, because you've got a really interesting and I guess diverse background.
Is that 30 seconds as well, Ben? Or
No, I'm not timing that one. That would be cruel.
My name is Sidney Dekker. Sid, as my mom used to call me. I work as a professor at Griffith University School of Humanities, Languages, Social Science, where I founded the Safety Science Innovation Lab some 12, 13, 14 years ago to respond to, indeed, questions from industry here. As in, we got to start doing something different because we're doing more of the same and not getting any different results. And we're just getting lost and mired in clutter and paperwork. And so that gave rise to the Safety Lab. Included in this was the idea of restorative justice, restorative just culture as a response to failure incidents and finding in many cases that, yeah, we can do this better. We need to do this better, more humanely, more compassionately. And we need to see the human in work again, in all kinds of ways. But other than that, yeah, so before I came here, this is my 7th country on 4 continents. A PhD from the US, was born just outside of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, married my childhood sweetheart way back and in love with her as ever. She's a professor of biochemistry at UQ. And so we moved here because there were 2 academic jobs at the same time in the same town on the other side of the world. We're in Lund, Sweden at the time. Yeah, a bit of a polymath in the sense that I also play piano, fly planes, all of which could have been careers if I wanted to. But my brain doesn't have the temperament that can do only one thing. So I've flown 737s for a while and 4 airlines out of Copenhagen mostly. And my PhD is in systems engineering from the Ohio State University, which is really sort of the birthplace of aviation human factors and still a hotbed of cognitive systems engineering there. I got a couple of masters in psychology from various Dutch universities.
Very good. We're just going to try this. So the first question is, and this one comes up so often on social media, what is safety? So let me press play on the timer and we'll just see how we go. Okay, let's go. What is safety?
The debate currently is whether safety is the absence of negative events, which is very typical and has reigned during the 20th century. 21st century says, no, we cannot measure safety that way. Safety is the presence of capacities that make things go well. We need to find out, identify, and then enhance those capacities. That is how we increase safety. HRO started with that in the 80s. ERIC, Safety 2, all make that same belief present now.
How do you see it? What do you think is safety, or what's the best lens to take for this?
Oh, measuring safety, the absence of negative events is compelling and interesting, but hardly predictive. You cannot really do much with that really tiny sliver of data that you get from only negative events. Yes, you need to look at them and learn from them, but if you really want to know how to make things go well, you better understand how they go well already, because much more goes well than goes wrong. So we often overlook that, right? We don't understand what people actually have to do to make things go well. Often things that we haven't thought about, not in the procedures or processes, and yet they do it every day. Better ask them.
Next
what was unfair was that your question was while the bar was already running, you know.
We don't really follow the rules that closely here.
Clearly, work is done versus work is imagined.
Yeah, I like to say work is prescribed because I actually prescribe the rules in advance, and clearly I just can't stick to my own rules, which we know that management is one of the most fervent breakers of rules.
Yeah, and one of the most useless layers in organizations to have to begin with. But yeah,
that's a whole different podcast, I think. Yeah, right.
Daycare for grown-ups.
In some of your work, you've referenced some earlier studies, like particularly in construction, where it seemed to be an inverse relationship between injuries and fatal incidents, so people dying versus minor injuries. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts, given most of those studies are relatively old now? I'm wondering, do you think that is an actual real stable finding, or is it more a statistical artifact?
So to me, that is not a statistical artifact, not even the original finding, but what you're referring to is Sherratt and Dainty's work in the UK construction company. No, Ben, this is something that I keep finding both anecdotally and in fact in the actual data across industries. And it has everything to do with honesty, openness, anything in an organization that puts downward pressure on people's willingness to contribute to the conversation, to say and bring bad news to the boss, has a negative effect in terms of predicting accidents. So the fewer incidents you are actually honest about, the more likely it is that something's going to blow up in your face, something that you cannot hide, something that you cannot play theater around.
You've argued in some of your earlier work, and it's probably pretty consistent with your modern work too, that human error might be more of an organizational problem rather than an individual problem. I was wondering, what did you really mean by that? Again,
first of all, the idea that human error is more of an organizational problem than an individual problem is, of course, not original at all. I mean, Jim Reason has talked about this, but it goes back much further than that, right? 1943, human factors pioneers, 1947, Fitz and Jones, they showed that human error is a consequence, not a cause of trouble, right? A consequence of things, how we set up work, how we expect people to do certain things, the pressures we put on them. You can trace human error to systematic features of people's tools and tasks, and therefore it is an outcome rather than sort of a cause of trouble. So that's not new or really interesting at all. It's, at the end of the day, just an attribution. That's really what it is.
Now, you mentioned the restorative approach before. So I've actually got a question around that. I think it's a really fascinating area. How does the restorative approach improve on the traditional just culture approach? Because just culture would surely have to be an improvement over retributive sort of approaches, but how does restorative take it another step?
Actually, most just cultures today are still retributive. They're organized around rules, violations, and consequences, and they just help you through various schemes and questions. They walk you through the various attributions that you can make into a place where you can feel comfortable about the response that you're giving. So most just cultures, again, are still retributive. Restorative just cultures ask very different questions. Who is impacted by this thing? What do they need? And this is lots of people, right? And who has the obligation to start meeting that need? That is a collaborative conversation that yields very different answers and very different pathways forward to restore the harm done.
Can compassion and learning really coexist with accountability in high-risk industries?
I think learning and accountability is possible only with compassion, because if you see accountability and an account as a story you tell, you learn from, you share, you are willing to fess up to, tell your colleagues about on a toolbox talk, then some measure of compassion is necessary, right? The ability to move closer, to be there, be present, understand where the other is coming from, understand their local rationality, and then collaboratively to act in ways that alleviate the suffering, but also prevent it from happening again. So again, accountability and learning is impossible without a measure of compassion.
The next question, I think, is almost like the holy grail. Like, obviously, you've written about drift. Rasmussen wrote about drift, and Snook has. So a lot of people have written about similar concepts of drift. Born with normalization of deviance. I'm really interested in your take on, is drift inevitable in organizations? And this is a question I get quite a lot on social media, is can we identify it in the moment as it's happening rather than retrospectively in hindsight?
I think in order to answer that question faithfully, Ben, we need to understand that drift happens in all kinds of directions, which is where Rasmussen comes in really helpfully, right? Because when we talk about drift into failure, we think about a safety, we're crossing some safety boundary. Rasmussen says, yeah, that's not how organizations operate, right? They operate within this envelope. There's a workload boundary, there's a financial boundary or economic boundary, and a safety boundary. And you have to remain within those boundaries. There's three ways in which you can fail, right? And so it always comes down to trade-offs. Can you notice those trade-offs? Jens says, yes, you can make them more visible to people and decision makers in relevant positions. Make the trade-offs visible, and you will see drift as it is happening.
As a follow-up question, is this the sort of work that you do in industry and you see organizations been able to navigate? So they look at the trade-offs with cost and production, et cetera?
Most organizations do this in a very underdeveloped way. It is often completely siloed. Individual departments, maintenance versus ops or something, right, do their own thing, and they have their own budgetary constraints to meet. They have their own workload pressures to manage, and they don't understand that in complex systems, right, you cannot reduce the functioning of a complex system to the performance of individual departments or roles. Right, the functioning of a complex system is the effect. Well, that's even an Italian word, but the outcome of the interactions and the relationships. That's where you have to look. And so, I don't think much of that conversation is very effective in organizations today. No.
That's it for part one. What did you think? Stay tuned for part two, where I finish this rapid fire Q&A with Professor Sidney Dekker, and help me feed the YouTube algorithm's lust for attention by liking and subscribing to the channel, and also leave a comment on the videos. I do my best to respond to everyone.